should now have a screen that says, why do plant names change? Introduction to taxonomy and nomenclature, or how to get a headache without even trying. Have you got that? Yep, good.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, but changes in plant names, Latin plant names, is just the bane of everybody's life, really. And it seems to happen with such regularity. And sometimes you wonder what on earth is going on. Why do we keep on changing things? And so I thought it would be quite interesting to actually look at why this happens. And I'm a taxonomist, and so I do this sort of thing all the time. But for the uninitiated, it must be really A, infuriating, and B, pretty opaque. So I can't pretend that I'm going to stop it being infuriating, but I'm going to try and make it a bit less opaque if I can manage. Now, the whole problem arises, of course, initially because we use Latin names. And you can think yourself lucky, actually, because this is Aristotle, who was really very, very early botanist. And of course, he was Greek. He used a different alphabet from us. So you can just thank your lucky stars that Latin is bad enough, but I can tell you Greek is even worse. Don't go there. So in some ways, it's an advantage that we use Latin. And really the first botanist, the first well-known botanist to use Latin was this chap. This is Dioscorides. In fact, he was probably Greek, but his works survive in Latin. We're not sure whether he wrote in Latin or whether they're translations. He was very interested in the medical uses of plants, and that has followed on. And following from him, you get several Roman chaps. This is a rather swanky-looking portrait, imaginary portrait of a chap called Pliny the Elder, who was also a very good botanist and wrote some of the very early descriptions of everyday plants that you would recognise today. I'm sure he didn't look like this at all. It looks like a Victorian portrait of some sort. But of course, the reason that folks use Latin at the end of the day is because it was, at the time, the lingua franca, as it were, the lingua Latin of the scientific community. This is Galileo. He was Italian, obviously, very famous for discovering the moons of Jupiter and the fact that the Earth goes around the sun, although he was banned from thinking that by the Pope. But nonetheless, he wrote, imagine he spoke Italian, but he wrote in Latin. Of course, so did this chap, very supercilious looking Isaac Newton, who also wrote in Latin. Of course, English was his native language, but all his works, all his scientific papers are all in Latin, because at the time it was the language of the scientific classes. And it meant that you could converse with folks from Italy, from France, from Germany, and of course from Sweden. This is Linnaeus, looking rather smart. We'll return to Linnaeus later. He was a Swede. He couldn't speak English, but of course he spoke Latin because he was an educated man. And so when he came to England in the 18th century, he wasn't able to converse with his botanical friends in English, but he could converse with them in Latin because everybody spoke it, or everybody who was a top-notch scientist did. So we have this huge inheritance of using Latin, and it's partly because of that that we find ourselves in some hot spots later on. But it's well worth remembering that it's there for a reason, and its real reason is that we can communicate with scientists all over the world talking about plants, and we can all use the same names. It's unfortunate that they're not English, but you know, there you go, you can't have everything. So you know, we communicate botanical and zoological communications. The names are all in Latin. And here's a page, in fact. This is from Historia Plantarum by a Swiss man called Bauhain, and he was a very good Swiss botanist. He lived in the 17th century. This is published about 1650, and it's a picture of what looks like a date palm, and you can the printing is a bit small, but you can see that the whole thing is written in Latin. And it's unfortunate in some ways because although modern languages are relatively easy for translation programs to manage, if you go online and you put in a piece of German and get it translated into English, it's pretty good, or Danish or Swedish or French, but Latin is really difficult for online translators to cope with, because the word order is so off the wall. And so they have a lot of trouble with Latin, which is really unfortunate. But all is not too bad, because things have got a lot better than they used to be. Here is the humble daisy. And it used to be called, and this was from a 17th century English botanist called Park. When he published his account of British flora, he called it Bellis perennis sylvestris simplex. So that's the simple plant, beautiful, the perennial beautiful plant that is simple, has one stem, a flower on top, and it lives in woods. So it was descriptive, a big long description, well, not too long description, but a rather long description. This is Bauhain, I showed you, the Swiss chap who published the flora I showed you, and this is his version. It's the little beautiful woodland plant. Spontanea, I suppose, means it pops up all over the place. And so you have these phrases which describe the plant. And this was quite convenient for a way to do it. Different people would describe a plant in different ways. And it was sometimes rather difficult to be certain exactly what they were speaking about. Some of the descriptions get even longer. This is Karastium, Karastium holostea, I think. And here is here's the name given to it again by Bauhain. Auricula, that's the eared plant. It's mouse-ear, Auricula muris. So the beautiful mouse-eared plant with white flowers. And so that's his descriptive phrase to describe what we now call Greater Stitchfoot, Karastium holostea. And we owe it to this chap. This is Linnaeus again. This is his wedding picture, his wedding photographs, in that photographs, but this is had his portrait painted on his wedding day, a bit before I expect, and here he is looking very swanky in his wedding clothes. And of course, he came up with several botanical ideas, and the only one of which has stuck is the idea of having a binomial Latin system. So we split plants into genera, above them we have families, and below the genus we have species, and so we have a species name, plants which are closely related, genus name, plants which are closely related, and then the trivial, the second name, which is for the species. And this is the Latin system, which you will be very familiar with because we use it all the time. It means, as I've said before, that botanists can communicate. So if we look at an example, a couple of examples, here we have the harebell, or bluebell if you happen to be in Scotland, and it's one of its names. Here is the phrase. This is a chap called Clusius, who again was a very well-known 18th century botanist, and he called it Campanula minor alpina rotundioribus imisfolius, excuse me, which means the little campanule which grows in the Alps with round leaves, and I'm not quite sure what imis means. Anyway, so he came up with this phrase, if you like, similar to the phrases we've seen before, to describe the plant. But when Linnaeus named it, he called it by the name we still use, Campanula rotundifolia. And interestingly enough, this is quite a good example of how effective and efficient Linnaeus was, because we'll see later on how many plants he named, but it was thousands and thousands, and many of them are still known by the names that he gave them. He was a very efficient and very accurate botanist, and his speciality was naming things. And so he gave it the name Campanula rotundifolia. Another example, this is the sea radish, and this is the phraseology. This is from the great British botanist John Ray, perhaps the father of British botany, and he lived at a time when these phrases were how you describe plants. He lived in the late 17th and early 18th century, so he published a fantastic flora, which you can still buy. Wrote in Latin, but you can get it in English translation now. And he described this as the yellow radish with articulated glabrous seed pods. That's luteum is yellow, rapistrum radish. Articulated means that they have like they're split into pieces. They have, radish. It has big football seeds, and the pod is really lumpy. Glabrous and hairless, and saliqua means Latin for seed pod. So that's the name he gave it, and again, of course, it's a very, very good descriptive name. But this is the name which Linnaeus gave it, the radish. It's the radish that looks a bit like a radish, so he coined this name, which is a binomial, Raphanus being the genus, of course, and Raphanistrum being the species. And that gives us, as it were, our modern technique for naming plants using their scientific names. And Linnaeus published in 1753 this book. It's still much used by botanists even today. I have a copy and I use it from time to time. Species Plantarum, it was in 2 volumes, 1753, and this was the book in which he started the process of naming plants using his binomial system. And the 2 books contain several thousand names, many of which I say are still in use today. And it's a very important book because when we look at the system of naming, how the names are applied on Wednesday, it all starts on the 1st of May 1753, which is the date we take as when Linnaeus published Species Plantarum. And that is the beginning date for modern naming. Anything that happens before that, you can ignore. So modern plant names start on the 1st of May 1753. We will come back to that tomorrow, on Wednesday. I'm afraid that although today is relatively straightforward in terms of its content, Wednesday is going to be a bit tougher. So I shall be going a bit slower on Wednesday. This lecture should be about 30 minutes. And on Wednesday, it will probably be 40 because I'm going to slow down when we get to some of the tricksy areas of nomenclature. But let's stick for the moment with the position regarding this problem of name changing. We've seen how the names arose, why they're like they are. But let's consider, I said earlier on I was a taxonomist. I also dabble in nomenclature, and taxonomy, I've put up there, is the science of naming things. So a taxonomist decides that a plant needs a name. It's an interesting plant, it's a new species that's not been described before, or it needs to be redescribed or whatever, and it needs a name. And that's what a taxonomist does. But the nomenclature wonks then decide what name it should have, how the process of naming takes place. Now, if you think about it for a moment, that means that because taxonomists are scientists, and not all scientists agree, you may find, and we shall see in a moment, that taxonomists will differ as to whether a plant needs a name or not. You've heard of lumpers who like to like to glue species together in large species concept, and splitters who like to split things up into tiny little pieces. So they might have, whereas a lumper might have one species, a splitter might have 10. And that's a matter of opinion. So what we're dealing with today is a matter of opinion. It's not a rule. It's entirely up to the individual, to each one of us, each one of you, to decide for yourself, theoretically, whether you accept that a plant needs a name. Do you accept that this plant should be split into 10 species, or is one species name better? And because it's a matter of opinion, it's a matter for each botanist, as we'll see in a moment, to make up their name, to make up their own mind, sorry. But what you can't do is decide how the naming system works, because that's a matter of law, as it were. It's a matter of botanical lawmaking. It's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of fact. And the reason that names change are sometimes taxonomy, because taxonomists change their mind, and sometimes it's because the rules have been misunderstood and we have to change the names because the laws of naming haven't been followed by some previous botanists, and we need to rectify that because something has happened which shouldn't have done. And what we're going to do with today, as I say, is the taxonomy side. So let's look at this plant. This is salicornia, Sanford, and I'm sure you've all seen this plant. It's one of my favourites, and my wife and I did a lot of work on these plants because it's particularly common on Holy Island, which is in my fiefdom up in Northumberland, and we have a large variety of what look like perhaps different plants. So about 10 years ago, we did quite a lot of work on salicornia, photographing and measuring them and so forth. And I want to use salicornia to illustrate what I mean by taxonomic opinion. So let's go to 2010, not all that long ago. And if you, I'm sure you all have or have had a copy of clivestasis New Flora, and he published the 3rd edition in 1910, and there were 7 species of salicornia in which he published in the British Isles. Some really quite common, like Salicornia europaea and Salicornia dolichostachya, and some really rather rare, Salicornia fragilis, which apparently does occur on Holy Island. We convinced ourselves we'd found it. So he set out a taxonomy in his flora which named and described 7 species of Salicornia and gave you a very nice key so you could try and work out which one you got when you were looking at it. Now, what happens next? Well, in 2012, a lady called Gudrun Karastium published a new taxonomy of Salicornia, and what she'd done was to take hundreds and hundreds of plants and analyze their DNA. It's always DNA now, isn't it? And she looked at the DNA of Salicornia across Europe, and she decided that using the DNA process, there were only 3 species of Salicornia. And to make matters worse, the first 2, Salicornia ramosissima and Salicornia europaea, you couldn't tell them apart. Morphologically, they were identical. There was no morphological difference. So what botanists call chemical species, which is rather nasty, really. I mean, that was rather unfortunate. And so using DNA technology, Gudrun had decided that there were only 3 species of salicornia in the UK. So far, so good. In some ways, it's a bit of a blessing, really. It's nice and easy. Much more difficult to identify 7 species than identify 3. Hand rubbing from those of us who had to do it. Yes, but you see, when Clive published his 4th edition a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now, he stuck to 7. Okay, one of the names has changed. The top name, which was pucillary, the original one, has become disarticulata. That's a different issue. But otherwise, you'll see the names are the same, and he's still got 7 species. All right, so what's going on here? What's happened? Why is this occurring? Well, it's because taxonomy is a matter of opinion. And Gudrun Kaderit on the left believed that she'd established, using science, using DNA techniques, that there were in fact only 3 species of salicornia in the UK. Clive is a much more conservative person, and he wasn't convinced. So he carried on, excuse me, publishing 7 species. So here you can see you've got a considerable difference of opinion. And I'm afraid I'm on Gudrun's side. I've read the paperwork, and my view, for what it's worth, is that Clive is wrong. So I only record or view 3 species of salicornia, because that's what I do. So it's a really quite a good example of people making up their own mind, that you decide, and in this case, people are choosing between one and the other. Now, that doesn't matter too much, because most people are going to follow what clivestasis says, because he's published a nice book, and that's what most people choose to use. And you know, you can argue the toss a bit about the odd genus here or there, but perhaps it doesn't matter. Not too much anyway. Yes and no. It can cause all sorts of difficulties. And this is partly the BSBI's fault, but only partly, because the BSBI have a system of referees. And the referees are there to tell you, give you an opinion, sometimes an expert opinion. I'm a referee and I wouldn't claim that my opinions are expert, but some people do. An opinion as to what plant you've got or what plant you sent them. And this is Irina Belaeva, this lovely, lovely Russian lady who is the current referee for willows, for salix. And if you send Irina some specimens, it's quite likely that you'll get your specimens back with a name that you don't recognize, because Irina's taxonomy is subtly different from Clive's. The taxonomy that Clive has published doesn't quite correlate with Irina's views. And so it's possible that you will get a determination for a name that you don't recognize. It's not in Stasis Flora, and you have to go digging around on the internet to find that it's published in, I don't know, in France, or it's published in Bulgaria or Spain or wherever. Because, I say, Irina has slightly different views. And I should have to tell you, embarrassingly enough, if you send me some new phrases to have them refereed, because that's my task in the BSBI, so the Eyebright referee, if you send me some plants, some of them, of course, I will identify using the names that Clive uses, but not all of them, because in some cases, the taxonomy that I believe in is not Clive's taxonomy, and so you'll get different names back. Bother. So it seems as though it's all nice and straightforward and easy, but once you start digging it around into the system, you find quite quickly that it becomes much more complicated. It becomes much more flexible. Now, this for me is a great strength, because of course we're scientists, we're all scientists, all of you in one way or another are scientists. You know, you collect plant records. You see plants and you can identify them. You tell people where they are. Well, that is science. We're all scientists. And one of the things that science is based on is disagreement. It's only by disagreement that we make progress in science. It's by arguing with each other and coming up with new ideas that progress is made. And so this is why this sort of situation where taxonomy is a matter of opinion is so absolutely really, really healthy. I know lots of euphrasia taxonomists, and we can all sit around a pub table. Usually we have to do it on Zoom these days and argue the toss about what we think the situation is. And it's unlikely that we're going to agree in the near future, because it's quite a complex issue. So for me, it's a real strength, but I appreciate that for many people, it's a real pain, because it means that you have to live with the fact that names are not as set in stone as you might like them to be. Let's give you an example. Now, this is one which has occurred fairly recently, and it's a name change which Clive has adopted, so we can be fairly safe here. These are the vetches, and on the left you have tufted vetch, Vicia cracker. You have wood vetch, which was Vicia sylvatica when it was in the genus Vicia, and on the right hand side you've got smooth tear, which was Vicia tetrasperma, the four-seeded tear vetch. Now, these have been in the genus Vicia vetch for a very long time. I haven't looked it up, but my guess is it will be probably back into the early 19th century. And all was well until they invented DNA analysis. And when they invented DNA analysis, eventually they began to look at plants, and as DNA analysis became more and more, became cheaper, more and more available, and was able to conduct much wider numbers of analyses, people started using it to look at these big groups of plants which all have the same genus name. And you can think of examples. Vicia is one. There are lots and lots of vetches. And I'm sure you can think of carex, for example, the sedges. I mean, how many carex species are there? I don't know, about 80, something like that. I mean, it's a big genus. I mean, in the UK, it's a big genus of plants, and you're just waiting for the moment when the DNA wonks get their hands on carex and they'll start splitting it about. And this is exactly what's happened to Vicia, to the vetches. So, if you look at the scientific papers, we're not going to look at the scientific papers, we're safe. But if you did, you would find that the tufted vetch has stayed in Vicia. It's remained where it is, where it's always been, Vicia cracker. And there are a couple of examples of its brothers and sisters. On the far right, you've got Vicia sativa, the common vetch, and Vicia sepium, bush vetch. And they have stayed put because the scientists who did the analysis concluded that their DNA was so similar to each other that they could all be in the same genus. So far, so good. But when it came to wood vetch on the left and smooth tear on the right, their DNA didn't match the DNA of the others. The DNA of wood vetch was quite different from the DNA of Vicia cracker and Vicia sativa, the common vetch, and bush vetch. And so it had to be moved. It wasn't a close brother or sister of those plants. It was a more distant cousin, if you will. And so it got moved into the genus Ervilia, which was a pre-existing genus of plants, but it didn't have wood vetch in it. So we now have Ervilia sylvatica. And it wasn't either closely related to the smooth tear, which in turn wasn't closely related to the other vetches. So smooth tear had to be moved as well, and that went into a genus called Ervum. And with, again, there are other plants in that genus, but smooth tear, from being Vicia tetrasperma, is now Ervum tetraspermum, and of course it's Latin, so you've got to change the ending round to make the thing work. So that's really quite a good example of DNA analysis working and causing name changes. Now, one of the things it's quite difficult to spot is whether a name change is down to taxonomy or whether it's down to a nomenclature issue. But usually, the rule of thumb doesn't always apply, but usually if the genus name changes, it's usually because of the taxonomists. It's usually because the chemists of this world have got at the DNA and decided that what we thought were close brothers and sisters of plants have turned out to be more distant cousins. And this is what's happened here. And you can see that the plants have moved their genus. They've moved from Vicia into Avilia, and in the case of smooth tear, Ervum. So I'm afraid that the days of large magnifying glasses telling us what species we've got, or using morphology to group species together, has rather gone. That's not to say that it doesn't happen. It does happen. DNA is not be all and end all. It's not the answer to everything by any means. But we've moved from morphology, from looking through a magnifying glass and counting hairs being the most important thing, to the DNA analysis being certainly the first thing we look at and probably the most important thing. It's much more difficult for people like you or me. I'm just an amateur botanist. I'm not a professional. I don't have a big lab. I don't have, I've got a microscope, but I don't have the wherewithal to do DNA analysis. So I have to rely on others to do that for me. So it's much more difficult for amateur botanists, but there's still good work to be done. And when the DNA chaps do their work, and I've purposely not made this too big because I don't really want you to worry about all the names, but here's the sort of thing that is produced. And this is a family tree of, well, two family trees actually of plants. And there is a well-known international group called the Angiosperm Phylogeny Group, and they are the people who have been sponsoring and collating all this DNA analysis and putting it to try and put it together and work out how groups of plants are related. But if I try to demonstrate, for example, if this plant here was in the same genus as this plant here, that will be fine, no problem. But if it's DNA, if this one here, its DNA shows that in fact it belongs up here, it would have to change its name. The genus name would have to change because it's just not quite close enough to be a close brother or sister. And you see down here, all these plants are going to be in the same genus, but these ones here are probably going to be in a different genus. So if they, on morphology grounds, perhaps Linnaeus called them all by the same genus name, they would have to be shuffled around. The pack would have to be shuffled by the DNA chaps. So what we've been looking at then today is taxonomy. We've been looking at some of the taxonomic reasons why plant names change. And it's usually because, to say, they're in the wrong family position. Not to say they're in the wrong family, but they're in the wrong place on this family tree. And we need to try and get them into a more sensible position. But remember that it's a matter of opinion. And I hesitate to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. If you don't like it, don't follow it. If you think that it's wrong, as I suggested, I think some of it's wrong. I don't agree. I don't follow it. I argue the toss. I tell Clive he's wrong, and it's a matter of opinion. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. It's good to have an informed opinion, though, because otherwise it's likely to drive you completely crackers. This is not me with the test tube. Okay, so that's a bit about taxonomy. What we're going to do next time is to look at naming, because once a taxonomist has decided that, let's go back to the vetches, once a taxonomist has decided that wood vetch and smooth tear need to be moved, how does the taxonomist decide what name they're going to be? How does he decide, she decide, that one's going to be in Ervilia and one's going to be in Irvum? Where do those names come from? Who makes that decision? Or right, not who makes the decision, but how is the decision made? And this, next time, is a matter of fact. This is not going to be opinion on Wednesday. This is going to be how, if you like, the botanical law works. And for me, it's one of the most interesting bits of botany, but it's rather arcane. So I should go a lot slower on Wednesday, and save your questions from today. Some of them I hope I shall answer on Wednesday. I hope to see you all again. If you haven't been totally put off by the lunacy of taxonomic principles, I hope to see you on Wednesday, and we should be looking at the naming of the names.